We are very, very short tonight. Very short. But we're glad you're here. The book of Jeremiah is a book in the Bible that most people don't read unless they're reading the Bible all the way through or something like that. It's a long book. It's one of the prophets, and consequently one of the neglected parts of the Old Testament. The things that people read in the Old Testament primarily are the Psalms. Then they read also some of the history and things like this, but very seldom do people read the writings of the various prophets. I think that's really too bad, because the writings of the prophets are some of the most informative things in the entire Bible. I had a teacher at Lipscomb, J.P. Sanders, and he said, when you read the minor prophets in particular, he says, when you read the minor prophets, it's like reading today's newspaper. And as I had this course in which he taught some things about the prophets, I realized that was a very wise statement. Some of the things that the various prophets have to say are just exactly the way things are with us today. Jeremiah is, he's not quite the same as the other prophets. Jeremiah is referred to as the weeping prophet. And when Jesus asked, who do men say that I am? Some of them said, you're Jeremiah. And so Jesus had a great deal in common with the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the prophet who lived just before the time of the Babylonian exile. And that turned out to be an important thing for us to remember as we read and study the book of Jeremiah. I'm going to do a number of sermons on Jeremiah just in order to familiarize us a little bit more with this great, wonderful book. It's a book that has a tremendous message for us today. You know, the history of Israel is a tragic history. They had everything to live for. And, to put it in colloquial language, they really blew it. They just really blew it. When they moved into the land of Canaan, God gave them the land. They had to conquer it, yes, but God gave them the land. This is your land forever and ever, he said. And yet, very shortly after they got into the land, they began making treaties with the occupants of the land, which God said, don't do that. But they did it anyway, and it turned out to be their downfall. And then they intermarried with these people and all this sort of thing. And the first thing you know, you have a really tough historical situation. This seems to have been the way of many of the ancient empires and all. Greece has never had another Alexander the Great, and Greece is a relatively minor player on the world stage today. The same thing is true of the Middle Eastern countries, although there's a great deal about terrorism and atom bombs and this sort of thing with them. They're not really considered to be real strong nations. They are not nations at the forefront of the development of things. The Caesars, well, Italy is not really a leader in the world today. These great empires just seem to have just faded away. Well, Israel is like that in one way and not like that in another way. It's not like that because there still is a country of Israel, and the Jewish people are very influential in world affairs. On the other hand, they are not. They haven't expanded or anything like that, and they're very ethnic. They're Jewish people, and that's just kind of what it is. So there's a number of tragedies that take place here in this whole thing. One of the longest passages in Jeremiah that dealt with what we might call just a block is called the Temple Sermon. The Bible doesn't call it the Temple Sermon, but he does open the 7th chapter by saying, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, stand in the gate of the Lord's house, and there proclaim this message. And then as we go on through the 7th and 8th chapters, we have what has been called the Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. And so this is what we want to talk about this evening. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of the sins of these people, because that's what Jeremiah talked about. And immediately we say, I'm not doing that. I don't commit these crimes. I don't commit these sins. I don't worship idols, and so on and on and on. And that certainly is true. We're not idol worshipers, and some of the things that Jeremiah will talk about here. But on the other hand, the principles that Jeremiah is appealing to are principles that we need to appeal to today. And the dangers that Jeremiah talks about are the dangers that we have in any society during any particular period of time. So, the historical background. When they moved into Canaan, as I said, they had the Canaan given to them. God warned them. Not only did he say, don't make any treaties with these people, but he warned them also against their religious practices. The religious practices of pagan people were absolutely atrocious. We cannot imagine some of the things that they did in the name of their gods. And so Israel gradually began taking on some of those things, and this turned out to be the downfall of Israel. As we go through the Judges, I've mentioned this a number of times, there'll be a paragraph that will start off and say, and Israel did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then it'll talk about the terrible things that they did. Then such and such a nation came in and conquered them, or a portion of their country. And then you read a little bit about that, and then the next statement is they cried mightily to the Lord. And then the next statement is God raised up a judge. And this was the whole thing, and this was the cycle that the Israelites went through. We wonder, why didn't they learn their lesson? Why is it that they kept doing these same things? Hey, folks, our culture is the same way. Why don't we learn our lessons? I remember when Kennedy was shot, my brother-in-law said to me, he said, this is such a horrible thing. This is never going to happen again. Well, attempts have been made on Reagan and also on Ford. They have to have a constant guard around our president. So people will decide, why didn't we learn? Why don't we learn from the things that have transpired? Well, that's just exactly the thing that Jeremiah was talking about. You see, in 722, the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians. That was a horrible thing to happen. The Assyrian people were among they probably were the most ruthless people in the history of the whole Middle East there. They were really, they had that kind of a reputation. All kinds of horrible, terrible things that they would do. In 2 Kings, we have a statement about this is why God allowed this to happen. And it's just a statement of the idolatry of the people, the immorality of the people, the corruption of the people, and the worshiping of idols and all of this sort of thing. And then you might say to yourself, boy, Judah could have learned a good lesson from them, couldn't they? The southern kingdom. They could learn a good lesson from them. Yes, they could have. They didn't. That's the sad part of the whole thing. And so during this period of time, the prophets arose, and Jeremiah was one of those great prophets. Jeremiah gave quite a number of warnings to Israel. He said that the people, the people put so much confidence in the fact that, well, now Jerusalem is God's city. Jerusalem is, quote, the holy city, as it's been called. The temple is the place that God has made his name to dwell. I'll tell you what, if anything bad is about to happen, what we need to do is hurry to the temple. Because God's not going to allow anybody to tear that temple down. That's his house. So if we go into his house, we'll be protected. Now that sounds foolish to us, but it was very real to them, and Jeremiah calls attention to this fact. He delivered this message in 609 BC. 22 years later, the thing that he had warned them about came to pass. The Babylonians came in and sacked Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, and destroyed the temple. Here's what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 7:10. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow after other gods you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we are safe. Safe to do all of these detestable things. Somehow or another, I don't know of a better way to express it, but somehow or another, God has become our servant. God, do this. God, do this. God, do this. Let me do this, God. I don't care anything about what you've said about morals and ethics. Let me live the way I want, and then I'll come to the temple and say, I'm safe. God is going to take care of me. Well, no, it doesn't really work that way. Instead, God said through Jeremiah, he said, reform your ways, reform your actions, and I will let you live. Well, of course, he's talking to somebody else. He's not talking to me. I'm okay. Then he says, do not trust in deceptive words and say this, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. You see, we can come and we can say and do various religious activities. And because we have done these religious activities, we think we're okay. It isn't the religious activities that God is after. It's obedience to him that God is after. And so Jeremiah says, if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien and the fatherless or the widows, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land that I gave to your forefathers forever and ever. Folks, that's not rocket science. That's real simple. He says, here's the way I want you to live. Here are the don'ts, here are the do's. Are these all of them? No, this isn't all of them, certainly. But the whole idea is that God says, that I want you to be a certain kind of person. I want you to be, as a nation, I want you to be certain kind of people. If you don't do that, you'll be destroyed. That's not too hard to understand. What happened? Well, two things happened. One is, Jeremiah he's a man that just always brings bad news. He is always getting on us about something. And so I don't like Jeremiah. Now what I like is this prophet over here. He always says nice things about us. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. The temple is God's place. God is not going to allow somebody to come in and destroy this temple. You're okay. I'm okay. You're okay. Feel good about yourself. Feel good about what you do. That's a positive attitude that you ought to have. Jeremiah comes along and says, God's going to destroy you. I don't like Jeremiah. I like this other guy over here. I like this other prophet. And so this was the type of thing that was constantly coming up. Well, in Christianity, we are saying to ourselves, surely he's not talking to me. I don't commit adultery. I don't commit perjury. I don't oppress aliens. I don't oppress the fatherless. I I treat other people right and just in a right and just way. He's not talking to me. Our contemporary sins are a little different in some cases than the sins of ancient Israel. But the principle is the same. The principle is God tells us that we are to obey him. In Revelation, as I was preparing this lesson, I thought, which of the churches of Asia was it that God said, you think you're this way, but you're really this way? It was Laodicea, of course. The difficulty that we have is that we do not see ourselves as God sees us. I think this is one of the tough things that we have. Jesus worked on this constantly. The 23rd chapter of Matthew tells us about the woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. And then he gave some little anecdote here to kind of explain what he was talking about. But my favorite one in the whole thing is that he says in the 23rd verse, he says, woe to you scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. You tithe mint and anise and cumin, the spices, But you leave undone the weightier matters of the law, love, justice, mercy, and love, justice, and faith. And he said, these you ought to have done, but not left the other undone. And then he says, you blind guide, you what? You strain out the gnat and swallow the camel. Now, isn't that a picturesque statement that Jesus makes here? And he goes right along with the same ideas as Jeremiah is talking about. And so the people at Laodicea, they were wealthy people. That was a wealthy church. It was a wealthy city. And they just said, we don't have need of anything. You will say, I am rich. I have acquired wealth. I do not need a thing. But you do not, listen to what he says, you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. You see, that's a big problem. I feel secure. I have money in the bank. I have good friends. I enjoy life. I am a religious person. I'm okay. And Jesus says to these very people who were saying that, you're not okay. You're wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. And yet it's so hard for us to see ourselves in this kind of a situation. And then Jeremiah goes to, in the 12th verse, he goes to the history of the people. I like this because I just like Shiloh. I like the old city. I've never been there, but I just like the old city. It's where the tabernacle was, and that's where Samuel's mother and father, Hannah and Peninnah, that's where they went to worship and all of this. It just kind of has a soft spot in my heart. Well, the Philistines came against the Israelites. You remember this? Incident? The Philistines came against the Israelites, and they, excuse me, they had war with them, and they defeated the Israelites. And the Israelites came home, and they said, what we need to do is to take the Ark of the Covenant into this battle. And maybe this is, it's a charm now. It isn't the holy peace that God intended it to be. Now it's a charm. And if we take the Ark of the Covenant into the battle, that means God will be with us, and we'll win this battle. Well, they did this. They took the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured, and all this sort of thing. And this was the Battle of Aphek, A-P-H-E-K, the Battle of Aphek. It took place about 1050. Well, guess what? Archaeologists went in and dug into Shiloh, which is just a relatively few miles away. They dug into Shiloh and determined that Shiloh was destroyed about a about 1050. So it's quite probable then that after the Battle of Aphek, that they went over and they destroyed also the city of Shiloh. So at any rate, the city of Shiloh, after the Battle of Aphek, you don't hear anything about the city of Shiloh anymore. And the ark, when they brought it back, they didn't bring it back to Shiloh. So, what does all this have to say to us? I think that it has this, that we can deceive ourselves into thinking that we're all right. We can deceive ourselves into thinking that, the church building, this is a holy place in the minds of some people. This is not a holy place. We're supposed to be the holy people. That's what the church really is. But, the government, if you come into a church building, they won't arrest you. And there's all kinds of things like this, that it's a charm. It's a charm. And people fall so much for this sort of thing. Okay, here's what Jeremiah says about Shiloh in the 7th chapter and the 13th verse. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple that you trust in, the place I gave you and your forefathers. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all of your brothers and the people of Ephraim. What's he talking about? Well, you see, it was about 113 years before that the city of Samaria fell, and the captivity of the Israelite people. It's kind of interesting to me that Jerusalem and Samaria. I don't know if you've ever been to the Holy Land. One of the things that you learn is everything's very compact. Everything's very close together. As a matter of fact, for me to go from Camarillo to about Rancho Cucamonga, right out there, is about the whole expanse of the country of Israel. It's about 75 miles, about 75 miles long. So it's a small place, and the northern kingdom had now been taken away just 113 years before this, and you would think that they would learn something from that. The city of Samaria, the capital of the north, was only 35 miles from the city of Jerusalem, the capital of the south. And yet, they didn't learn the lesson that God had intended. And so here's something else that he says. The 7th chapter and the 22nd verse. For when I brought your forefathers out of Egypt, I spoke to them. I did not give them commandments about burning. I did not just give them commandments about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this commandment. Obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in all the ways I command you, that it may go well with you. But they did not listen. They did not pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts. The temple sermon is just filled with things like this. The temple sermon takes the evil of the people, their apostasy, their idolatry, their immorality, their corruption, their neglect of the poor, and all of these things, puts it into kind of a nutshell there and says, this is why your neighbors to the north and your countrymen to the north in Samaria, this is why they were taken captive. This is why God allowed their country to be destroyed. Don't do the way they did. And what does he say? He says, I called and you didn't answer. I admonished you over and over, again and again. You didn't respond. So Jeremiah is a very practical book for us. If we think not in terms of the specifics of the sin that these people committed, but if we think of the principles that they were violating, the principles of godliness, the principles of goodness. And maybe in our generation we're a little closer to idolatry than we think we are. Paul says, avoid greed, covetousness. Avoid greed or covetousness, which is idolatry. Martin Luther made a statement, I've heard that he did anyway, where he said, whatever your heart clings to and relies upon, that in truth is your God. Stop and think of where our values are. Stop and think of where our principles are. Stop and think how we fit into the things that Jeremiah has been talking about. We're going to sing this concluding song now. Let's stand together.